Well, I am really thrilled to be here. I had a great day pretending to be the visiting professor from afar, actually just from Weinberg, and it was quite thrilling. I got coffee and lunch, the whole thing. And what I was really impressed with was the energy and passion at McCormick. It's really palpable, and I'm really proud that Northwestern has such an extraordinary asset as the Siegel Design Center. So thank you, all of you faculty and dean who welcomed me so warmly today. I'm just going to think aloud with you, because engineering is not my area of expertise, and because I love to think aloud. And what that means is I believe in interruption. I'm writing about the concept of interruption. So if something stirs you and you think, no, that's not right, please interrupt me, and you then become part of the presentation. So we're going to talk about what it means to be good, and what it means to draw good lines, and what it means to cross lines. That's the subject of ethics. And the clicker, such a lovely device. Okay, so here's the design of the talk, because all talks are designed. And notice I have a son who's an architect, so I got the right terms here. I'm going to talk first about why we think about ethics at McCormick, and what's the point of design, what we call the telos of design, the nature, goal, and meaning of design as the part of the master plan. I'm going to talk about what it is to create desire, and who does desire create. You both create the desire for markets, and then the desire shapes the consumers and users. In design development, I'm talking about who you're serving, who you're working for, and how that works, the ethical issues therein. Then I'm going to talk about the construction documentation, which is what's your plans for sustainability and public health. One of the great contributions of Siegel Design and McCormick is an enormous focus on sustainability and public health. I'm going to try to convince you that sustainability is a terrible word, and we ought not use it, but we have to use it first. And then I'm going to talk about administration of construction. What are the issues for workers and builders when you make the big projects, and how does that play into our ethical sense? And then finally, I'm going to go to stewardship, which is how is a lifetime of responsibility created? Now, one of the remarkable things about having a son who's an architect is that not only do I have a son who will live beyond me into the future, please God, but he's building things that will live beyond him into the future. So I have this his buildings are my grandchildren in a very important and deep sense. He works for Weissman Freddie, and he was just given, they just won the contract not only for the Botanical Gardens in Brooklyn, which was just on the New York Times page, says his proud mother, but for the mall in Washington, D.C. is going to be transformed. And I thought to myself, in this heart of our nation's capital is this vision of what democracy looks like. And so that notion of living beyond for a very long time raises specific ethical questions about the future and about where you're going. So that's the design before we start. So first of all, I'm going to make the first claim. Premise one, everything is an ethical issue. Every gesture is rationed in a world of scarcity. Every choice is a choice. We're here, we're not there. We're in a particular location, not another. We frame the world by seeing it. And what I want to say is it's all an ethical issue, but we come from specific locations. And one of your previous speakers had an interesting discussion about morality, and I want to make the philosopher's differentiation between morality and ethics so we can focus on the ethical problems and not the moral ones. Every single one of you have a strong moral code. I know that because you're engineers, you're here, and your faculty and students, you already have had a lifetime of shaping and authority and texts that you care about and orders that you think are important to follow, an order of life. The shared text and the shared norms and the shared authority constitutes your moral stand, where you come from. And when our students come to Northwestern, it's too late to change their essential moral code, nor should we. If I was the moralist for Northwestern, you would be appalled, and you should be rightly. I do ethics for Northwestern. Ethics is about difference. It's about people coming together in the agora, for Aristotle, and having a fight about which God's prophecy should we follow. How do we determine what the good is? What is the good act, and what makes it so, and what do we do when we strongly disagree with the nature of the good, and how we determine that? So ethics is about dissent, and we live now in a deeply pluralistic society with very different, and all, by the way, rationally defensible positions and defensible moral arguments that we need to have out. And that's what the job of ethics is. Now, how societies decide the good act and what makes it so then creates strong cultural norms that are also aesthetic. Then we see them played out, and it's codified in the long history of the humanities, the good act and what makes it so, which is why we study humanities. and in the shape of our habitation itself. What we think is good, what we think is appropriate, what we think of as impoverished is played out in how we build and how we locate our cities, or how we don't locate them and how we leave them to what we think is a stochastic dimension. Now, I show this almost all the time to my undergraduates, and I ask them to choose which is the most natural. And so some of you who've heard me talk before have had this discussion. So what's the story here? Right? What's the right answer? Clever design people. Which is more natural? The left one? This one? Yeah. Now the right answer is, who said both? Yes, both. Because they're habitation, and you can see they both have a little plastic there, right? They're little wood. They've got wood here and here. And they're both where beings take their children to feed them, like little warm beings. This is Ty McDonald. I just love this one. And then the bird's nest, which was actually outside my house this winter. So. Okay, another trick that I say is, which is more natural? We're going to come back to Versailles. So which is more natural here? Now, this is a trick question, and only Californians know the right answer. Any Californians in the room? Okay, Yosemite? So it's both, right, of course. Because Yosemite, this is Yosemite one Valley Oak, right, surrounded by nothing. And now it's kept like that because Boy Scouts go in there and whack off the pine trees to keep the meadow there. And before that, the Native Americans who lived there would burn the meadow to keep off the small pine trees so their oaks could be harvested. And Yosemite Valley is a garden, and that's one of the reasons that it looked like a park, hence national parks, because of this setup in Yosemite. As the budget has fallen apart, it's only the Boy Scouts that keep Yosemite after. And this is, of course, the Gardens of Versailles, but basically the same. So the answer to this is, in a designed world, you can see design everywhere. And that's the next slide, too. Not only is every single gesture ethical, everything is designed, and of course, it's Bruce Ma's great exhibition where I learned this term, this notion of everything is a design. There's almost nothing left in our world that's like fundamentally natural. We've come into every part of our world, and so that's why we have these little things like parks, tree forests, little forest preserves, and for our pet trees in Skokie, and then larger versions of this in Yosemite, but they're all designed as well. Now, we live in a world that's shaped by speech acts, by gestures, and by the built objects that you do. So every gesture, as I said, is a moral decision to do this thing and not this thing. Every gesture has a nature and a goal and a meaning associated with it. There's no value-free place. This is called in philosophy saying there's no view from nowhere. Every place is somewhere. And every act implies a deep order, how we exist in space, and how we exist in time, and how we exist in relationship to others. I just learned about fish and why we're not fish, because we can see much further, so thank you for that. Every planned design creates not only a physical terrain, but a moral terrain in which the designer creates a sign. And for philosophers, a sign, and for religious theorists, an ayat, the term in the Quran, a sign is a word that stands for things that come to mind, brings other things to mind. Now, when you make a sign in language, you're creating a word that implies much other things. Say, meadow is a sign for a whole constellation of ideas. When you make an object, a built object, you're making a sign as well. It just says a fascinating thing is that each line in the Quran is also called an ayat, a sign for God's presence in the Quran. Now, signs bring things to mind, but they also act as justifications or incitements to behavior. And Bruce Ma's idea that, in fact, when you plan something, you're planning for the anticipated behavior, the specifics and scaffolding of response is an interesting piece about why we know that things are framed in a very particular way. So, the existence of the other is the beginning of ethics, and what does that mean? Modern philosophy, emerging from a Hellenistic idea of the world, thinks a lot about thinking, thinks a lot about being. The nature and the order of being is primary for philosophers, and it's logical that it should be so. Being anticipates the order of the self, the hungers and the desires of the self. Ethics is what happens when the order of being is disrupted, is interrupted. And the usual order of being is interrupted by the cry from the vulnerable other, the widow and the orphan, the stranger at the gate. It's the entrance of the other, the face of the other for Emmanuel Levinas, that raises the question about the limits of one's freedom or autonomy. So the usual order of being is self-preservation and self-rule, autonomous. So we think a lot about the right of autonomy. For Immanuel Kant, who asked the three questions, they derive from this sense. What can I know? What ought I to do? And for what can I hope? Notice the I, at the center of Kant's autonomous Enlightenment vision of the world. But into the order of being comes the other, says continental philosophers, says religious texts. And I would say the three questions are not just what can I know, what ought I to do, for what can I hope, though those are very good questions, but what does it mean to be human in this world? What does humanity mean? What does it mean to be free, to make such choices? Are we truly free? What are the boundaries of our freedom? And finally, I think we have to ask, what must I do about the suffering of the other who stops me in my being and reverses the order of my being? So, an ethics of design then applies a larger question, not only the questions of ethics, but the questions of the ethics of design, which means more than just one other, a collective other. So how do I then discern and judge between my others? How do I take it from the relationship of self to other to self to collective others? This, in philosophy, is called the problem of the third. And for Emmanuel Levinas, who thinks about judgment and discernment, says the third necessitates making a choice. Resource choices, decisions on who's right or wrong, so judgment comes into your design immediately because it's never just a house for one guy. It's always a habitat for a community, for a collective. So how do I discern and judge? How do I achieve justice? The next question's for you. How do you design within a world you cannot control, which is essentially stochastic, biological worlds? How do you do that? What are the constraints imposed by this? Notice I'm not calling it the natural world, as if there's some space that's not natural, because I just told you what I think both of those. So then what are your duties to the orders of non-human things? How do you defend them? Should you defend them? Are you the master of the non-human biological world? What are your duties towards the past? How is the past brought into the present? How does the past affect our choices and our constraints? And how do we think about future others who you can't tangibly see? And who are far from you, not only temporally, spatially, but temporally, and what are our obligations to them? Now, most rational science is based on ethical concepts of the good. We value certain endpoints, and we value certain outcomes, and we have this strong idea, post-Enlightenment norm, that we can do an action in our time, and it will then have consequences that we can then assess and weigh in time X. It's an interesting fiction. It's not necessarily the case, but it is how we value things. So then we value certain endpoints as either risky or unsafe or good based on what we can bear to lose. But then we have to ask the next question. Bear to lose what? People? Which people? Market share? Polar bears? So these questions of sustainability have to do with what we choose to value strongly enough not to lose. So that's a core question that I ask my graduate students. What could you not bear to lose? What could you not bear to have? For religious theory, the question of having and ownership and possession is a freighted question. Do we really have anything? Could you lose everything? Peter Singer, the philosopher, who says you ought give away everything except what you need for a basic level of sustenance because the other deserves all of that. And so it's an interesting question about this concept of the good. So those were the master presuppositions that I think before you even begin, now you have a concept. You begin to think about the thing you're going to build or make. Well, then you're not just making a building, as I said. You're making a future. You're imagining the trees that will be there in 15 years. We're imagining the world that will surround your built object 50 years from now. That implies that you are here now and that you have a certain stance and a certain position and a certain set of values. The future you build then is built based on an assessment of the present. Do you like the world now? Do you think now is beautiful or just? And if not, how do you propose to change it? So The future, by the way, is not there, waiting passively to be arrived at, but already in place. It's not a neutral time, and this is the work of Stephen Moses. He thinks rather, it's not just an empty form, that there's a future, and we just have to sort of make time to get to it. The future is human expectation and hope and patience and impatience all at once. For Moses, is discussing here the Tower of Babel. And what's wrong with the Tower of Babel, we just had this discussion just a few minutes ago, what's wrong with the Tower of Babel is that it's never finished. It's never finished because they think they have an infinite amount of time to make an infinitely perfect arrangement. And that's the sinful nature of this. The future, says Moses, isn't waiting to be there, waiting to be perfect. You just have to plunge into it, which is why it is new and risky. So for Moses, this notion of the concept not being perfect is critical to design itself. But the future is expensive. Speaking of towers of Babel, I'm thinking of the large buildings in the Middle East, for instance. Who's funding the projects? Where's the money coming from? What sorts of limits does this relationship overtly impose in terms of where people are going to work and how their work will be shaped? What constraints does this relationship imply about what's said and not said? Can you build anything? Ought you to build anything if someone will pay for it? It's an interesting question. Is there any client you would refuse? Spears, for instance, didn't refuse Hitler. Mies, complicated, did sort of. He wasn't sure he wanted him. It's an interesting story. Is there a client that you would not build something for, even if the money he gave you was infinite? Do your students know that at the bottom drawer, there has to be what we always call the quit letter, the bottom line about what they were doing, even if it was not going to be used for a specifically evil intent? Should you work for any client? Now, this was today's paper. I love to switch something from the New York Times. So this is Gary's new work. Celebrated Architects Hong Kong Rental Building helps define super luxury. Now, what I loved about this article was here was this discussion of the Hong Kong skyline, a roll call of celebrity architects, right? And there they were, this concept of super luxury, right? That was in the business pages. On the front page of the business section was a discussion of the crushing debt, the college debt faced by ordinary students and ordinary families. And it was just like we opened the page, and like on one hand, increasing impoverishment for the middle class. On the other hand, this concept of super luxury. Not just luxury, by the way, but super luxury. Is that what you want to be doing? Is that the right concept? Is it even an ethical concept? Now, who's served by your design?
So can I just...
You can go right ahead.
So you mentioned Albert Speer.
Yes. Yes.
The other case could be that was buildings.
Yeah.
The other thing would be something more artistic, I feel.
Right.
Lonely.
Yes. We made beautiful films about the Olympics. Yes.
So, is there a point in which conveying film is more kind of ephemeral, and it may convey some certain artistic viewpoint, even though you are commissioned this by a client that you don't want to serve?
Right.
Will you draw any distinction in something that has this balance between utilitarian value and artistic value? Will you draw a distinction between those two models?
No, I think that artists and architects and all should have fled Germany and should have said, I'm not doing this in the service of this view of the good. And those films, while beautiful, are all about the nature of a certain kind of masculinity, a certain kind of Aryan power, a certain kind of presentation of the body, the white body in a certain way, mastery over others. So there was no neutral place, which is my sense of. There's a lot of times when you're in these situations, you're told, well, don't take a stand. We have to take a stand on something. And my position is, this is a philosopher's position, you're always taking a stand. There's no non-stand worthy place. You can't like go to some other place in the universe where people don't take stands. By staying there, you're taking a stand. You're reifying this concept of the good, this concept of the just, this concept of beauty. And that was something that people were quite confused about in totalitarian regimes. And it took someone like Hannah Arendt to really make the claim that there's no such thing as as collective responsibility for these acts. It's all individual personal responsibility. I responsible for everyone and I ever more than others, says Dostoevsky. And that notion of individual responsibility, even for the artist, is a critical piece of my claim. Now, lots of people disagree with me, but that's my claim. Right. I'm glad. So, sure, go ahead. I meant it about interruption.
Okay. How do you think technology is changing this perception? How many people do you think actually have the opinion that you share, which is I'm personally responsible? And I say this because I had an interesting conversation yesterday about how the increasing effort to engage with the crowd, if you will, through technology and social media is dissipating the sense of individual responsibility, because now you have so many people backing you in this effort. Right? And how is that influencing people's perception that they are individually responsible?
That's a wonderful question, because that's the dark side of democracy. Right?
Right.
If everybody agrees with me, maybe I'm not personally.
That's what
so Hannah Arendt, who I taught this quarter, writes very, very beautifully about this, the problem of collective responsibility. And she says, at stake is always the death of the other. And for her, who's a reader of Socrates, who believes in the Socratic ideal as you should allow yourself to be killed rather than do an act against your will, against your conscience. And she said scornfully, did people not remember Socrates? Did the scholars not remember Socrates when she's talking about the philosophers who failed to defend the Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals when they were rounded up from the academies? And she says when people always say, well, it's not really the Pope, or it's not really this person. It's like we were all responsible. And she uses that in when she's discussing civil rights, and she's discussing Little Rock. Oh, there's just a collective burden of racism. She says, no, there's every individual person making an individual choice how to be in the world. And it's interesting that it might be dissipated by the sense of the collective, the crowd, or even worse, the anonymity of the crowd. The notion that I can just click a thing for Coney and I'm part of this larger thing, but I don't have to actually have a face-to-face discussion about the complexities of the issue. I worry about that part, the anonymity of it. Yeah, I'm all about the face, so it's a healthy thing. So increasingly, habitats are built by the rulers. And what's interesting at a certain historical point, and really you see it a lot in Tudor architecture, the king begins to envy Wolsey. He begins to envy the rich people and the counselors because they have better stuff, right? And so this idea that the wealthy begin to set the stage even above the ruling class, it becomes an interesting part of European aesthetics. However, in American and British design, I'm just going to get a little side trip here, there's always this corresponding dissent voice. There's always been this concern for workers' safety that begins in the 1800s, goes very strongly through the progressive era, an arts and crafts movement, and creates a shift in not the ruling class's idea of the good or the beautiful, but a larger populist movement. I'm just going to say a little bit about this. This is Humphrey Davies. Now, Humphrey Davies is one of my favorite scientists. Does anybody know why? Right? He made lots of things. So first of all, not only he made lots of things, he wrote poetry that Coleridge and Byron thought was better than theirs. So this guy is your basic Northwestern students, right? He can do it all. He's got humanities, he's things about ethics, he has this he's interested in gases and the property of gases, and he, of course, is one of the first people that understands anesthesia and the notion of anesthesia and the recreational use thereof, which almost kills him, actually. And he also, later in life, after he's in the National Academy, he develops this elegant and simple thing. Now, this is probably quite exaggerated, because look at him all dressed up, all fancy, in the mine. But he does go to northern England, right? He applies his skills in this is long after the gas thing. He goes to northern England, and he hangs out, yes, underground, with they're not as clean, they're very dirty and depressed, and miners who had terrible risk. Now, this is linked to the early days of the Industrial Revolution. They got to get the coal out of those northern England hills, right? They've got to get it out, but it's a tremendous cost because they don't have electricity. They have candles, and they have coal dust, and they have methane gas, and they would have horrible explosions. And the workers said, you know about gases, Humphreys, and they got the fancy guy from London to go and wander about and figure out, and this is one of the early elegant designs used for as long as there was candles, for how you dealt with this problem, the Humphrey Davies lamp. And the Davies lamp, people had songs about it, and it was quite the amazing, genius design product. Now notice, it had no use for the wealthy. The mine owners liked it, but quite frankly, there was a lot of Welshmen. And they could have blown up a bunch. It slowed production, but this was really for the workers. The workers themselves built shrines to him. Lord Byron actually writes a satiric verse on him about this map. It's actually, Byron calls this, the 1819, the patent age of new inventions. This could be written now about Steve Jobs. But notice that it's the patent age of new inventions for killing bodies and for saving souls. All propagated with the best intentions. Sir Humphrey Davies' lantern by which coals are safely mined for, and the Modi mentions, Timbuktu travels, voyages to the poles, always to benefit mankind, as true perhaps as shooting them at Waterloo, right? So notice the irony, the early irony and cynicism of the poets of the Romantic Age. So this spirit, though, that design should be for the people, inhabited the progressive era and the early 20th century in American design. This is Cook County, old Cook County. Can you see it? It is a beautiful building. And remember the first picture that I showed of Versailles and the gardens? Notice that the idea was to have it look to be a palace for the poor. The care with the facade is done on this beautiful aging building. Still there, they don't know what to do with it. It's too expensive to destroy, right? And it was on postcards from Chicago because it was seen, this house for the poor, as the most beautiful thing in Chicago. And it is, I mean, look, it is a gorgeous set of buildings. I once got lost in LA County, the same thing in Los Angeles where I grew up. I once got lost giving a bioethics talk, and I wandered into the murals, the entrance lobby of the LA County, and it was beautiful murals. And they're all, of course, shuttered and gone, and now people line up in this kind of soulless little emergency room. But before, it was we build for the poor, by the poor. The workers themselves will see the goods of their labor, and they will live in these palaces. Notice the assumption that those such choices made. Now, in schematic design, it's all about optics and shaping. I want to give you just two brief cases. One is, of course, Hofmans Paris, the modern city. Now, here we have an intersection, right? I didn't know that this intersection should play such a large role. But you know the story for Hofmann. Why did he build the boulevards for Napoleon III? What was he after? Two things. On the one hand, it was about the theory of miasma and about the poverty of a medieval city and the intricate ways that in medieval cities, cholera epidemics had killed 20,000 people in this period just before Haussmann begins to reconstruct Paris. But it also was seen as a device to control people, to control the poor, because in these Haussmann boulevards, as opposed to the left bank, which is non-Haussmannized, you can't set up a barricade to keep the troops from coming into your neighborhood. And so the Haussmann actually had replanned the city, and the contemporary critics said he will make democracy impossible after the French Revolution, because there was no way that the masses could rise up against the troops in these large boulevards. Case two is, of course, our own Ludwig Mies. Now, by the way, he adds Van der Rohe to his name, which is a fakey affectation, so that he can work with the German aristocracy who he wants to impress. He's not allowed to say von der Rohe. He has to say Van der Rohe because he can use the Dutch version, but it's impermissible to use the German von because that's only really for the nobles. But he plays this out for quite a long time and has a successful career increasingly rejecting classicism as aristocratic. And of course, the aristocrats wanted to reject their own history and his view of the past. He joins the Bauhaus. He becomes to be the last director of it. He edits G magazine, which I think is adorable, about, and what he does is he thinks, I'm going to create open spaces as an armature for flexible social activity, which is the view. You strip away and you create an emptiness. Now, horribly enough, he was rejected as not German enough. He does refuse to his story, he tells that he doesn't want to serve Hitler and he flees, but he also can't he's not German enough because his name now sounds too Dutch. so then the aristocrats don't want to hire him either. These social acts turn out to be Nazi marches in his large spaces. So the trouble is the scaffolding can structure specificity only in part, right? He wants it to be a socialist revolution. He has ideas about it being, the social acts to be spontaneously organized for social good, and it turned out the same spaces that he was part of thinking through became this new sort of armature that we see go tragically wrong. As design development, we say the details of design matters, and there's 3 ethical issues that I wanted to just briefly touch on. And I'm just going to touch on them briefly because you do such a good job of knowing these ethical issues here, but I think they bear repeating. Public health and safety and the environment and sustainability. So first of all, I'm going to try to convince you that sustainability is not enough and to move you to a new value called hospitality. A sustainable world, a world that sustains itself given the constraints that we now live in, I think is to perpetuate an injustice. It's not good enough what we have now. It's not nearly good enough. There's far too many people that live on $4 a day. There's far too many women that give birth under conditions of incredible oppression and risk. There's far too many old people that are, and more of them all the time, that have no plan for the future. So I don't want to sustain this particular world. I want to do better. And that's why I want to move us from this language of sustainability to a language of hospitality. Now, those of you who know my predilection for biblical language know that the first act of humanity in Hebrew scriptures is, of course, and in the Quran, the same act, is the opening of the tent on all 4 sides by Abraham. And notice, Dean, this is an architectural structure of a position in the desert, that the tent will not be closed, the sides will all be open, and it will be pitched at the intersection. Very McCormick. Pitched at the intersection, open to all travelers that come. This deep notion of hospitality means that we have to create a world in which we welcome the guests, we welcome the stranger. Yes?
Just a quick reaction. I find it's very interesting that you use the word hospitality because oftentimes I find in design we use the word zero impact, right?
Yes.
And it's really getting to a neutral state. So sustainability is perhaps to be things at the status quo. Zero impact is
I want more.
Right? And then hospitality is actually say let's actually give in some way.
Something about, right, hospitality, by the way, in this biblical, with this scriptural language, is about sacrifice. It's about giving what you have to share. And it presents me with the ethical possibility of saying, I always have enough for the other. Now, for Emmanuel Levinas, the term, when he says, what is it to be a human? He says, to be a human is to be the one who must come up with the goods. The one who must come up with the goods for the other. And for Paul Ricoeur, a theorist, a Christian theologian, he says the essence of theology is that there's always enough. There's always abundance. Abundance is always possible until we have in this country an extraordinary amount if we could figure out how to be hospitable. Now, we did a project based on this notion of hospitality at Northwestern. The Brady project this year was looking at the waste that we generate here. I should show my plastic bottle somewhere. So all the plastic and all the trash and all the waste, where does it go? And we asked that question, and we found that all of our waste is not dumped on our campus or stored on our campus. It goes to the 5th Ward. Now, the 5th Ward, our students found out, is the poorest, economically, the poorest ward in Evanston. It's directly west of us. It's right across from the high school. The dump is Viola Dump, and it's exactly across from the high school and from a park, by the way, a public park. It's right on Church Street. It's now behind closed doors. And it's the waste transfer station, not for the city of Evanston, but for Wilmette and Winnetka and the North Shore and Evanston. So what in essence is the richer, whiter suburbs and our beautiful campus dumps its trash on our neighbor's lawn. And our Brady students said, this is a wrong. We found out about this because the community came to us and said, Northwestern's responsible for 51% of the dump. Turns out we're only responsible for 2%, but it took a while to understand that. But they perceived it as all of our stuff. And I have to say that Morty Shapiro has taken this, they wrote an 81-page white paper, has taken this idea to heart and said, when we build, and we're about to build a whole new campus, and when we live and how we live our daily lives impacts the neighbors. What we do here impacts there, and we need to rethink this. Again, to go from sustainability status quo, even reducing our own waste, to radical hospitality saying, not in our neighbor's lawn. Now, public health is the other consideration. You're not trained in the School of Public Health. And one of the interesting things is that architects are they create the armature for public health. And architects used to be trained in public health. Often people that did these designs, someone like John Locke, who wrote our Constitution and was a doctor, also did sketches for early London. And notice that public health is really has language and limits for what you do when you have failures in large environments and sets consequences. And the new demands for public health have to do with transparency. So all of you who know me as a colleague at Northwestern know that one of my main concerns is, are our processes transparent? In German architecture, when you go to Germany, you can see the architecture that they do there is often glass walls. And there's the interesting theory, it's a theoretical choice, they make the walls of glass because people want to make sure that the bureaucrats are fully observed at all times. I have to say it's a little disconcerting when you go to these buildings and people put up little pictures of their children on the glass walls because they don't like to be so visible. But the notion that transparency starts from the bottom up in the New Germany was a part of our architecture, and it ought to be a part of the ethical considerations. Now, safety. Now, obviously, when people think about things that are safe and unsafe, and next week I'm going to talk about synthetic biology and the organisms that we can now design and engineer, we think about safety. But do we think about safety for the long, long term? Now, in Europe, the ethical consideration of is it safe when you design it is dealt with by putting up the precautionary principle. I think the precautionary principle is the wrong way to go, and I've spoken about this before. A European idea is that any technology, any intervention, any built space has to be proven safe before it can be enacted. Now, Americans, being pragmatists that we are, we like to try things out. So we like to try something and then see how the consequences go. The precautionary principle, I think, is not useful for our society. I think we have to do more than that, actually. I think we have to say, we have to think about what you will do over the long term, and I'm going to lift up a principle called fidelity in an answer to this. But safety, the case in point obviously being Japan, safety is impossible to assure. It's impossible to assure because error is inevitable. Failure is inevitable, error is inevitable. Now, in medicine, we teach doctors to begin to say this all the time, never to cover it up. But in architecture, it's a terrible problem because you're supposed to build buildings that don't fall over, that are perfect, that stand the test of time. So I want to raise this ethical question. You know that error is inevitable in all human activity. What does it mean to live and work in a world in which error is impermissible? How does that happen? I used to work for NASA as a national advisory consultant, and so we thought a lot about the inevitability of error. It's a whole other talk, but it was a haunting problem for the shuttles, as you can imagine. And then finally, learning to bear failure when you know that error is inevitable. How does that happen? In construction documentation, this for me raises another set of interesting ethical issues and a set of questions that I really struggle with. Case in point here is Qatar. Now, like everybody else who's been to Qatar, you're struck by the magnificence of the project, right? You've been in it. It's frankly magnificent and apparently quite purple these days. Education City has some of the most staggeringly beautiful buildings I've ever seen. They are extraordinary, graceful buildings. And it grew like the mushroom. There was nothing there, and now there's this beautiful buildings there, and the art museum is a remarkable object. But the people who build it are there under conditions of duress. They're brought into the country and their passports are taken from them. They can't leave until they can repay the people who bought them, the transport agencies who bought them over. They can't just leave if they don't like it. It's 120 degrees in the summer, and they don't stop work. They're housed in barracks, women and men separately for 3 years. It's difficult for them to contact their families. They have a half a day off a week. And should that matter to us? How much should we know about it? To whom are we responsible for this? And this, for me, makes an experience like our campus in Qatar a difficult ethical challenge. I'm not saying, well, we shouldn't be there, we should not. We should think about it. What does it mean to be there? How are we there? What must we know? What ought we to know in Kant's formulation about the conditions of human freedom in that country, and how ought we to intervene. What about the conditions of work for production and design? This actually comes to me from my son, who says, you know, you should be sure to tell those students they're going to graduate and they're going to make less, and he's in a high-end firm, Weissman Freddie, right? They're going to make less than you would make as a high school teacher, right? He's going to make $40,000 a year and have enormous debt. What do we think about those conditions? What about that production? What about the idea of sharing between design teams? When something is developed in science, science is fundamentally iterative. It's published, it's shared, because it's not owned in quite the same way that architecture is owned. So if something is figured out in architecture, it's not necessarily published. It's not necessarily explained. And so literally, design teams have to reinvent the wheel because the process is upfront, open competition between teams instead of a narrative of sharing. Very different from science. What are the ethical implications of that? Finally, I want to end by saying after the thing is done, the stewardship remains. I feel, and you can see this in someone like Brunel, who felt personally responsible for all of his stations all over England. He would actually go and visit them all the time, and his bridges, and in fact died in the making of Kingdom Brunel, in the making of the bridges. The personal responsibility, not only for the life world of the building as it is made, but for the life world of the building forever. Now that's a big responsibility. It's like having a child. But let me say as an ethicist, I want an architect to be responsible for his building forever. I want the engineer of the BP oil platform to be responsible forever. Now why? The reason is because the people that live there are responsible forever. So why not the construction? Why not the designer as well? Now, I'm telling you that I believe in this principle of hospitality, but I also believe in what I'm calling the principle of fidelity. As a corrective to the idea of precaution, instead of front-loading the precaution with a lot of moral panic and concern, I want to back-end the project with the sense that if you build it, it is yours forever. You are forever responsible. I know it's a terrifying thought, but I actually think that it has a strong philosophic premise. Now, why? Well, in bioethics, we have a rather, in some ways, thin account of what we mean by good science or technology. We tell you don't violate the rules that we give you, FDA, for instance, NIH, and rules of construction, legal codes. We tell you not to lie, don't clean the data. We tell you to publish with integrity. Anyone who teaches fundamental ethics classes will go all through these. You know, be nice to the graduate students, right? One of my favorite ones is don't say it's going to be revolutionary, or the Messiah is coming, or it's going to be redemptive. Please, that's religious talk. That's my business, right? Just build the thing. It's good. It's going to be good. It's going to be strong. This and that. It's not going to. It's not. That's another Tower of Babel problem. You don't use human research subjects against their will or animals. You don't lie to people. You care for the human communities over the short and long term. Now, anyone can learn these. No one intentionally wants to violate those unless they're deeply evil. Everyone, you can teach these, and they can be taught. But I'm going to say, for designers, you need something more. You need to live in some deep sense in a free society where people who don't have power can speak truth to power and can tell what they're thinking as they develop it. You have to take responsibility, as I said, for the outcomes of your work. And you have to think about funding. You have to think about how things are funded so that people aren't benefited unfairly. And there has to be some system of distribution for the goods that you create. In case people desperately need them, then it has to meet some standard of human decency, ideally far more than some basic minimum standard. You have to never be paid just to give a specific result. You're not a vending machine. You're an artist when you're a designer. And finally, I would say you need to give attention to the poor. You need to give attention to human suffering. And I would even argue strongly for a preferential option for the poor rather than a preferential option for the wealthy. Now, I know that's a difficult call to make since the wealthy are the ones who are paying you to do it, but can you think about the needs of the poor as primary, even in those situations? Tall order, that's what I'm asking you. Now this is because I don't think much of human rights I think much of human duties. And I think there is a relationship between your right to be an artist and to be a designer and to make a big and beautiful object and your duty that is implied by that gesture. Society's trust in your science and in your technology and in the new things you make means that we allow them to undermine what is known. We like big, bold, new buildings. We like you to go outside the boundaries as long as you are honest, as long as you're doing it for the vision that you're telling us you're doing it for and not for yourself, as long as you're careful and as long as you seem relatively sane. You have a right to free speech and to free expression, including to design anything you want, but the right draws power and authority from your duty to be both truthful and to be on the side of humanity. Now, my idea here is that there's a bioethical need for this duty that emerges from the brokenness of the world itself. Where does the duty come from? It comes from the deeply unfinished quality of the world. The fact that you as engineers see the world as fundamentally broken, in need of repair, in need of finishing, lots to do, right? You can see that. I've walked around with engineers on this campus, and I know that impulse is there. The model here is the debt relationship, that again is a fundamental reality that many religious traditions say. They say what is important is that you are always in debt. You are born in debt to the other. It's literally true, you're born in debt to your family, and you live trying to repay that debt that society gives you. It's true in the Elizabeth Warren sense that all of our acts are only possible because of the work of others. Because of the work, because of the gardens that are planted by others, because of the streets that are paved with our tax dollars, because of the buildings that are constructed by the combination of taxes and goodwill, we live in debt to the reality of all of the others who watch us. And in that model, the designer has a debt to the patient, has a debt to the user. The premise here is that when you own something, ownership itself is limited. The corners of even your field that you harvest, in scriptural terms, belong not to you, but to the poor, to the vulnerable. Can you build buildings with that premise intact? Could you take profit with a corner given to the other? What would it mean to build a building and always make sure that 10%, the corners of the building, do not literally belong to the owner, but belong to the public, to the poor? The promise that you're doing it for is because everything is a witness to duty. And the premise here is that you're going to seek other than marketplace incentives to try to construct a good society. Now, I know, we're living under the shadow of Kellogg, that we believe in the free market as the main, perhaps the only incentive for good behavior. But I'm going to say we need to lift up another model, that there has to be another system of incentives. Now, many people find it in religious texts. People can find it in the humanities. But it has to be found that there has to be some other call besides that which can be named and numbered and valued in terms of the market. Now, if you do this, and if you are transparent and honest, and if you remember that you are brave and might fail, then I think you have an ethical design. I just want to summarize what I've said. You create desire, not need, against a background context of enormous scarcity and enormous challenge. You've said it beautifully in the movie that I just saw about all the pressing conditions and all the things you face. I've raised the issue of hospitality, formerly known as sustainability, about climate and the environment should be a priority for you as you design. I've raised the issue of justice for communities, workers, and global citizens who construct these buildings, and for designers by the same token. I've raised the issue of public health and safety. And finally, I've said that to do any ethical design requires questions about power, about framing, and transparency. So I'm not the kind of philosopher that just says, oh, here are all these questions. I'm the kind of philosopher that also likes a normative idea or two. So what should you do? Given the fact that ethics is a part of all of design, and that design is a part of every gesture in the world, and that every act is a sign for a larger set of values, what do we do here at McCormick, at Northwestern? First, I think we should teach quite broadly. The interruption of being is best achieved, I really believe, by the entrance of the humanities, who pull a call that comes directly out of disorder, that says the other first, after you, in Levinas's terms. Lessons of humanities need to take place in engineering schools, just like lessons of engineering and practicality need to take place in Weinberg. We need to know lessons of culture and of history and of place. To what are people committed? What will they die for? What will they live for? That's a piece of your design. I think we need to create strong individual moral agents. I teach this whenever I teach the ethics class. I feel like I hand them the rules. I feel like I'm teaching in traffic school, right? That's not what I want. I want someone alone in the lab, alone in the design studio, alone face-to-face with the CEO of the company, to have the moral fiber to say no, even if no one's watching, if no one will ever find out. That's what I'm trying to create here. We have to create strong moral agents, perhaps partnerships, communities of meaning that last a lifetime, like the building they're going to build. What would it mean for every Northwestern undergraduate in this engineering school to know that the partners they meet, their small team, would keep tabs on them, know them, care about their work for the rest of their lives? How hard would that be? What would that be like if you knew you couldn't just escape the gaze of the other? Create an otherwise than market incentives I've already spoken about. This is a pun on Levinas's term of otherwise than being, the disorder of being. What motivates us? Why are we here? What motivates our students? What should motivate them? Can you create in your teaching, in our university, another prophetic vision other than the free market? Is there anything else? Is there anything outside the sphere of the market that we ought to teach them, that they ought yearn for? And develop, finally, my two principles. Let's explore what it means to not have sustainability be our goal, but hospitality be our goal. And let's try to define more keenly what the ethical commitment of fidelity to promise-keeping means in concrete engineering terms. I want to end with a thank you. Thank you first to the Dean for the invitation and for a wonderful and continuing challenging conversation. To my son, Noah Levy, who works at Weiss Manfredi and gives me lots of great ideas. For the synthetic biologists at Northwestern who've introduced me to the wonders of McCormick, to Bruce Mao, whose work I follow and have for a number of years since his great exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Jessica Peixoto, who was the first woman to get her PhD at the University of California of Berkeley, my alma mater for my doctorate and for my undergraduate work. She is completely unknown, one of your classic lost voices, but she was interested in, yes, design and economics, and the economics of daily life and design, and she tried to put this together in her early work on the structure and design of the communes in Paris, which she got her doctorate in. Emmanuel Levinas, whose work on the face I use, Immanuel Kant, of course, for his great questions, the colleagues in religious studies at Northwestern, my wonderful Brady students who accomplished a great deal this year and continue to accomplish it, and their graduate students. Yes, I see you in the back for wonderful engineering graduate students. And of course, the mayor and aldermen and the citizens of the Fifth Ward who challenged our students to think about the design of our lives at Northwestern and the impact in their world in the Fifth Ward. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening. So, we have time for questions. I'm here.
How strongly attached are you to the word?
The word hospitality? I'm deeply attached to it. I'm open, though, to other suggestions, but it became that the term sustainability speaks to me of a continuation of practice that I just feel dismayed about. I just feel like, no, when an American talks about sustainability, it has a valence.
Sometimes names
yes.
get corrupted. I mean,
yes.
Cosmos to cosmetology.
Yes.
But sustainability got on because it conveys a picture. I don't agree that is no change. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the world is flexible enough that everybody can have their own
right.
sense of opportunity.
Yeah.
Fidelity, I think, is a nice word.
I'm fond of fidelity. Yes, it has that Aristotelian feel to it. Yes.
Fidelity has marketing value.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Well, it's a tragic story about hospitality. It got taken over by the hotel. It's like some hotel industry thing.
Exactly. So it has illustrious origins, but
yes, I know. Jessica Bisciotto, who was an economist who was interested, she actually did surveys like what's the design of the criminal justice system and the foster care system and how they're linked. She was a systems theorist in that way. And she went around and she interviewed college professors to say, are you getting paid enough and how are you using your money? Things like that. Very practical. So at Berkeley, they gave her a position. She was in the economics department, but then they developed a program called home economics. Oh, right. And the declension story of Bisciotto and why we don't know her work, which is magnificent systems design, is because she got shunted over. She lost, as soon as it was called home economics, it was like the thing the girls did. And then it became like cooking, right, and nutrition. And it's a tragedy. And you're right, I want to seize hospitality back from, Hyatt and make it, like a decent word again in all of its resonance. But I'm open to suggestions, to other ways. Sacrifice, I thought of sacrifice, but it was like too much.
Someone else should ask.
Yes.
But I raised the same point with your environment, with the word hospitalist.
Yes.
Which is a nice concept, but it's the wrong word, in my view.
Yeah.
Because you want to attract the best to that sort of position, and I don't think the word attracts, but that's my own opinion.
But you know what? There's a flaw with it. I understand the hospitality. It's so tainted by, it's like we're calling it the entertainment industry or something. It's sad that it's come to this. But so I'm open for other meaningful suggestions that get that idea across. Yes?
I don't have suggestions, but on your comments about responsibility and holding responsibility after design, made me think about Yamasaki, who I consider to be maybe the most accidentally failed architect in history, who both designed the World Trade Center and also Pruitt-Igoe, which is the housing complex in St. Louis, which is very famous for its complete failure in construction in the 70s. And what I think is interesting about that is that Yamasaki is a very accomplished architect and many other successes in modernism, but he happened to build the two kind of large emblems that mark different eras that represented failures in cities, and that neither of those were really his fault. And on September 11th, I actually very distinctly remember thinking, what is that architect thinking? And then later learning about Pruitt-Igoe going, that must be one depressed architect. Yeah. So I think what's interesting about that, and especially in the case of Pruitt-Igoe, is that my perception, looking back on it historically, thinking about his position and responsible as the designer of that building, that I wouldn't have been the only stakeholder, and I wasn't the only person who needed to hold responsibility over what was created. And that I believe that I like your point about responsibility, but I believe as designers we need to have a role in facilitating others, all the other stakeholders who are involved in also holding responsibility. And I think that's something that we're not trained to do. We're not trained to facilitate other people understanding why it's important. So while we might hold these ethics, we don't know how to communicate them out. So I was wondering if you had any advice on how we learn to do that.
It's a really brilliant question and important because here I am saying everyone's personally responsible. And yet every design project is a huge collective, both in time and in physical space. But if every single person takes themselves on the Dostoevsky sense of I'm utterly and ultimately responsible, I more than others, that sense is how you go forward. So that you should have the capacity to say no. I'm worried when people can't say no to something. We spent a lot of time about this at NASA. The Morton Thiokol case is the one that obviously that we teach all the time, but there's many other cases. And I myself understand how alluring groupthink can be. I was on the National Advisory Board and made several horrible mistakes by just looking at the PowerPoints and not raising my hand and saying, what do you mean that's going to be like that? Because you get intimidated, but my inability to say no just at certain points is one piece of a far grander and more tragic failure. So I bear responsibility for every time I've participated and partaked of those design projects, even as a philosopher, He wasn't making anything. I'm a receiver of this information. I think if you were responsible, yeah, the guy who designed the World Trade Center does bear that. That's his story. Robert Moses and the Cabrini Green projects, they were a mistake. Now, sometimes that's why I say it's inevitable. When you design those buildings, when they had those beautiful ideas for towers and greens, they didn't imagine actually them living there, which I think was part of it. And they didn't really, they made a mistake. It seemed like it might work. It wasn't done like, let's trap poor people in inhospitable settings. There was this vision that should work, but it didn't. And then the people that bore the burden are the people that had to live there and have their lives torn apart by just the structure of it. The BP oil spill is where I began thinking about fidelity. You know, there's a huge oil spill, and it should have worked, but the engineers and the architect and the CEO, he was off yachting, this kid. He said, oh, this has got to be too much, and he went off yachting. He should have been there cleaning the beach every single day. That's what fidelity might look like. And that's a heavy burden. I understand that I'm putting a harder life before you than anyone else perhaps has yet. But I think it's the life that you've taken when you begin to make things out of metal and stone and use other people to work. It's like being a general of a war, right? You've engaged other beings in their embodied projects, and you've paid them not even maybe enough to make this huge project that lasts for generations. So I don't want to have you have a limited responsibility. I want you to have a total responsibility, a ceaseless responsibility. Tall order.
Do you realize that you get good advice from crisis management?
Yes, absolutely.
Because
no one ever asked me, but on the beach. I want them on the
but
beach.
But the CEO of BP had put the yellow jacket,
yes,
and grab a couple of tags and clean them up, and that appears in the news. That would have been a different story.
Right. If he'd said, I'm not leaving the beach.
Yeah.
I'm not leaving the beach because it's mine to clean up, that would have been a different story. And not just the optics of it, but the actuality.
Yeah.
The feeling that he has to sacrifice everything should be, that's what fidelity would suggest. Yes?
Well, I know it's getting late. I was just curious because you mentioned the poor, you mentioned the disenfranchised. You don't mention necessarily the disabled. And yet the disabled and how they function in this world is key. I mean, we talk about it all the time. We have all kinds of rules and regulations, and it has a deep, deep ethical, I think, implication in how we design.
That's absolutely critical, as speaking as a temporarily able-bodied person. I know that, in fact, when we think about the world and the aging population that we face globally, we need to rethink how the world works and how it is shaped and how you go up and down the stairs and what's available to us. I can't see that little thing because my eyes are no longer good enough to see that screen, right? So, so every aspect of our designed world has to be rethought in terms of the different abilities of people.
Through the eyes of the other.
Through the eyes of the other. If you think other first, after you, as the critical moment of ethics, the encounter with that otherness, then you can really learn how to rethink the world along ethical grounds. And that is the core piece of ethics.
Martin Buber, right? Yeah,
well, Emmanuel Levinas, right? Not even I and thou, but like, it's all about my duties to the other. The other, I can't bear any responsibility for what the other thinks of me. So it's a non-reciprocal, utter sacrifice to the other is the way Levinas would push us to see the world, what we write, what we build, what's expected of us.
Yes.
But implied in that, isn't there something of, I know what's best for the other, which may or may not be true?
If you listen to the other, you might hear. If you have to make a choice, says these ethicists, between what's best for me and what's best for you, better to make the choice what's best for you above my own needs. It's very tempting. When I teach to undergraduates, everybody says, well, what about me? Aren't I an other to the somebody else? Right? Aren't I the other's other? Levinas is just not interested in that. Right. And you're right.
I'm not concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the person who built Cabrini Green, thinking that they were doing
it right.
exactly the best thing for the other.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the horrible reality that you're going to make a dreadful mistake in almost every move doesn't mean you don't have an obligation to try to do the best you can. Cabrini-Green failed for lots of complicated reasons that the designers could not have imagined in advance.
And so, I actually agree with you that what's important is to put the other in front and do the best you can. But this piece of ultimate responsibility, it really, I guess I feel like it's the responsibility is to do the best that you can for the other and to be humble about the results.
Right.
Because the results may or may not be the best for the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's my best attempt at the best for the other, but it's not necessarily the best at being humble about it.
Right. One of the things I teach in the for the Brady Scholars Program is to these highly successful students who are wonderful and very successful and have been A students their whole lives and are full of the act of goodness to come to the Brady Program, is that you're going to fail. You're going to fail. Because social change is very hard, because it's easier to get it wrong than it is to get it right. And because we're human creatures, fragile human creatures, failing isn't the problem. It's getting up after and trying again. And that's why fidelity is more important than precaution. Because you can't keep it from the bad thing from happening. The future is not waiting for you in that sense. You must try. This is my American pragmatism speaking, my Jane Addams, John Dewey. You try it. But then you're responsible for the failure too, as well as the success. And I think that's part of what I think about. Architects just can't be responsible for the success. They've got to be responsible for the success and the failure forever. That's why Frank Gehry gets to like, oh, Frank Gehry is a Gehry building. Yeah, but if it falls apart, it's also a Gehry building, right? So that's why it's a high stakes and very personal challenge that I'm asking you to take on. And that's the ethical challenge.
Thank you so much.